We'll talk about member access. So in general, there are two different types of member in a class. One of them is what we call data member. These are properties that we have inside a class. The other type of member is what we call function member. So these are methods. Basically, if you look at this example that we've been using, say if there's a class called CRACT, an instance of CRACT is declared on a stack. Here we're calling the data member, and here we're calling the methods, right? Or the functional member. Sometimes we call them a functional class or a class member inside C++. So this function member can also be the member function. And a lot of times we call them methods in other programming languages. Access to a public member of an object. So here's the difference. You can have this object being declared, like in the example of racked, right? This is declared on the stack. If that's the case, then you got to use this dot operator. Now, if you have decided instead, now this instance is dynamically allocated on the heap, then this is what we call a pointer, right? A pointer pointing to this racked in memory. Then you have to use the arrow, right, operator. So these are the two differences. In either cases, the access specifiers, the rules for those stand. If they are private, right, meaning if X is private, then you cannot access it, right? This is assuming X is that. Now, if the area is under public, meaning they'll be publicly accessible, then you can invoke the area method, right? Directly from using the dot operator, you have a declare instance, or using the arrow operator if this is dynamically allocated on a heap. Class member function definition is different than member function declaration. Declaration is something that sits inside a header file. Definition or implementation sits inside a CPP file. Right? So when we have a member function that sits outside of a class, we need to also include, right, it's the class that it is a member of. For example, in the example that we've been using, set value, this is a method that sits inside this class, right? So by way of the declaring, right, this method outside of the class in a definition file, then we have to make sure that we have the class name included as well. And this double colon is what we call class scope. So it's important to include these two. If not, then this member function is not really a member function at all. It becomes a function rather. So set value is what we call methods, right? Method of what? Method of the C rectangle class because of this, right? And method is different than a function. Method is always a part of the class. And this is the reason why we call it member function, which is different than a function. And a function is outside of the class, right? So you can write a standalone function that has nothing to do with any of the classes. And then you can execute that function regardless of whether that class exists or not. So this is an example of a method definition. So this method definition returns a void, right? So you got to make sure that your class scope is sitting in front of your method name, right? Not before your return type for that method. And this is an example of a method with an initialization list. So this is very similar to constructor initialization list, right? There's a various reasons why we do this. First of all, this is extremely fast, right? So you're passing in this value of A and B and assigned these values, right, to X and Y, which are the member values of that class. There's various reasons for non-static data members that cannot be default initialized, right? We use member initialization lists to assign these things to references and constant qualified types like X and Y. But regardless, this is one way to initialize it. Or another way of initializing your X and Y members is just simply write this inside this content here, right? Or Y equals B. We'll take a look at the next step in, how we can define a member function inside of a class. This is another way of defining your method or member function. So you can have it all inlined. So inline basically means that we're just going to define it inside the declaration, the class declaration itself, as is. And this is good if like this entire payload is small, right? If you don't want to have several pages of definition inside this class definition, because is simply way too big, and it becomes very unwieldy, right, to manage this. So this is frequently used if the payload is small. Otherwise, if you were to take this set value, right, outside of the class, right, outside, then you gotta make sure that you include your class scope, right, set value, right, so on and so forth. And that's how you declare and define this outside of the class. All right, so this completes our discussions on member function definition.